boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today the professor of biblical and religious studies from Grove City College. He has a PhD in church history at the University of Aberdeen. He's the former William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University and a former professor of historical theology and church history at Westminster Theological Seminary. I want to introduce to you today Professor Carl Trueman. Carl, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Phil.
We're talking with you today because you have a new book that is about to be released, and you've done numerous other books that you've written as well. But this one in particular is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. That's a long title to repeat, brother. And it is actually it's released November 24th, but you can pre-order them now on Amazon.com. And if you go to YouTube, I'll have the links there. And if you find this on certain podcasts, you should be able to click the link that it will be put there if you want to find that. It is currently the number one new release in popular psychology of sexuality, according to the rankings of Amazon. So it ain't even hit it hasn't hit the print yet, and it's already popular. That's pretty amazing.
I wonder how. Yeah, that's a very popular category. Of course, it probably means I've probably sold 3 books or something. Yes.
I don't know. It had the word sexuality in it. I assumed that that instantly perked up.
That's true. Might get a few creepy people by it.
You're right. Yeah. Let me see what that's about. But So what was this something you always wanted to write about, or did something along the way recently spur you into investigating that?
Well, no. I mean, my background is I'm a Reformation historian. Really, 16th, 17th century Reformed Protestant thought was my specialist area as an academic. This book emerged from a number of causes lie behind it. One, Rod Dreher, the journalist at the American Conservative, and Justin Taylor at Crossway both asked if I would be willing to write a book on this guy, Philip Rieff, sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And as I started to read Rieff, who's most famous for writing the book The Triumph of the Therapeutic in the 1960s, I became interested not simply in expounding Rieff, but in applying his thinking to the present day. So that was one strand. Second strand was I'm a historian. I get intrigued by historical problems, and it puzzled me that the statement, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, that my grandfather 35 years ago would have regarded as not making any sense at all, has become part of the political fabric of the West, particularly in the United States, to the point where denying the coherence of that statement is likely to get you into trouble these days. And thirdly, as a Christian, I was interested in trying to help others understand that the sexual revolution, things we see around us, particularly the LGBTQ movement, aren't isolated phenomena, right, but actually fit into a much larger picture of how Western culture has changed over the last 300 or 400 years. So there was those three kind of prongs driving the project.
Yeah, because nothing happens in a vacuum. Let's try this. It's usually some kind of influence, some cause and effect going on over time, a principle that may at one time been meant for something different and thought of a different way morphs into something different, historically speaking. But how long did it take you to dive into this and iron it out to this final work?
Well, I started the reading in 2015. I was then fortunate enough in academic year 2017 to 18 to have the William E. Simon Fellowship at Princeton University. So I had a whole year just to focus on the research. And then I finished the manuscript, the first draft, about a year ago, got it into the publisher, and I've spent the last year editing it, working it over, polishing it for the final product that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time.
How far back did you go in history to track to where we're at now? Where'd you start at?
Yeah, well, the starting point in any history book is always, that's always in some ways the most difficult thing, because wherever you start, as you've already said, nothing happens in a vacuum. Wherever you start, there's always something behind that. But
always a predecessor.
Yeah, I started with the figure of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Genevan philosopher of the 18th century. Rousseau is the man, I think, who's most influential in developing what I call in the book the notion of the psychologized self, that who and what we are is most fundamentally what we feel. It's not reason so much as it's our inner instincts that determine who we are. And there's an obvious connection there with the transgender question, because if you're talking to a transgender person, the person they are is precisely who they feel themselves to be inside. It's not their body, it's their feelings that are determinative of how they think of their identity. So Rousseau was in some ways an obvious figure. There are precursors to him, but I start in the mid 18th century with the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
And basically that's kind of a new concept, historically speaking, throughout humanity, is it? Where you determine kind of from what you feel inside what you are versus other forces kind of fashioning you to who you are, right?
Yes, it's. I mean, in some ways, it's not entirely new, because you go back to the Bible and read the Psalms. People have always had feelings, and feelings have always been influential on who we think we are. But with Rousseau, it's radicalized. But if you were born in the Middle Ages, going back to my ancestors in Europe, I'd have been born to a peasant farmer. My identity would have been very much given to me at birth. Yeah, I'm the son of a peasant farmer. I'm going to grow up to be, guess what? A peasant farmer. That's what I am. I'm going to live in the same place. I'm going to be baptized, get married, and buried in the same church. There was a fixity to my identity that came from outside. With Rousseau, that gets sort of flipped on its head. Rousseau wants to say, well, all that may be true, but that isn't the real you. That's a perversion, a corruption of the real you. That's you being squeezed into a mold that really you shouldn't have to be squeezed into. The freest, the most authentic human being is the one who is able and free to be outwardly that which they feel themselves to be inwardly.
So I'm supposing then a lot of this is then tied to a notion of identity and from whence it comes.
Yes, I mean that's the burden of the book in some ways, that to argue that what we live with today is a different sense of human identity to that which would have been found, as I say, in the Middle Ages, where identity was very much given to you by external circumstances. And that notion took a long time to die and fade away, but we're now living, certainly in the West, at a point where identity is something that we believe we can create for ourselves. We do that in numerous ways. Think of fashion. We wear clothes to do what? To express our individual identity. We buy things in order to make ourselves into that which we would want to be. The most extreme form of this, I say, is the sort of the LGBTQ movement, where you can create your own gender. You can be outwardly whatever you feel you are inwardly.
How many cross disciplines did you put into this book? For example, have you is this just strictly a historical observation, or was there ties to psychology and theology and other things like this? Like, because the thing that comes to my head is the whole nature versus nurture argument. And to me, this direction that we're talking about kind of comes away from both in a way. Like nothing's fashioning whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the great thing about history is history is by virtue of what it is, a sort of interdisciplinary thing anyway. But I had to read history, psychology, ethics, philosophy. All of these things factor into how we think today. Big figure in the book is Sigmund Freud, because Freud is the man who makes the move to say that in pre-modern times, sex was something you did. Freud is the man who says, no, actually our sexual desires constitute who we are. So sex, if you like, in the modern world becomes not what you do so much as what you actually are as a person. So I had to read a lot of Freud as well. So it was great fun from that perspective. I've always been rather undisciplined in my reading habits, or read whatever I'm interested in. So this was a great excuse just to read a whole heap of stuff that I was interested in that I wouldn't normally get my hands on.
Well, you're not undisciplined. You were cross-disciplined.
That's one way of looking at it.
That's your excuse.
Yeah, I find it very hard to do things I'm not interested in, which is, I always thought that discipline is being able to do things you're not interested in. I've never been able to do that.
That's kind of how it's viewed. I suppose habit's the other thing, maybe perhaps, of what we have. So yeah. So was Freud a major fire then? Because I mean, I've often been disturbed by his teachings in psychology on many levels, and a whole bunch of it is sexually oriented.
Yeah.
Sorry, is he like one of those flash in the pan things that made everything take off, or?
He's not I mean, a lot of his theories are now debunked. When I teach humanities at Grove and we do a class on Freud, I'll ask I have students from the psychology department there, and I'll say, do you read Freud in psychology? Yes. But I say, where do you read him in the psychology department? As part of the history of psychology. He's not typically used as a source now for constructive psychology. Where he's significant, though, I think, is in that move that makes sex part of human identity. That is something that continues to grip the social imagination. So I think he's important on that front. He's also oddly important in a positive way, in that in his little book, Civilization and Its Discontents, he really argues there that societies are defined to a large extent by what they forbid sexually. Our sexual codes are very important to the identity and the preservation of our culture. And I think he's correct on that when you go to a society's sexual codes, you see something of what society considers to be very important. And that raises an interesting question for us today, because we're at a point in history where we've almost totally dismantled traditional sexual codes. And it raises that question as to whether society, civilization, culture can survive in that kind of context. Freud was oddly conservative on that point, in that he thought that sexual repression was often a good thing because it made life bearable. It helped us sustain civilization. The question Freud, I think, would have for us today is, if you get rid of all sexual repression, can society and civilization survive? It's an interesting question, and I think the jury's out on that. We don't know. We're in the middle of that experiment now.
That is an interesting question. If there's a stability in that, and I believe there is, if you totally remove those parameters, you're not preserving any culture, but it's like this tension in fighting for one's identity, which in the end will require a culture in which to exist, right?
Yeah. And I mean, if you think about what sexual ethics look like today in society, by and large, our ethics are predicated on consent. The idea is, as long as it's taking place between two consenting adults, it's okay. Well, that's problematic. The #MeToo movement has demonstrated that's problematic, because sometimes consent is a very, very difficult thing to articulate when there are differences in status and power involved between an employer and employee, for example, or Harvey Weinstein and a starlet, for example. Secondly, that ethic doesn't protect us from incest. Two consenting adults can engage in a sexual relationship. Why can't they be father and daughter, or mother and son? And thirdly, and most worryingly, I think it doesn't necessarily protect society from pedophilia. You might say, well, yeah, but a child can't consent. To which the response is, well, actually, we don't require children to consent to a whole heap of stuff. They don't have to consent to having a vaccine. They don't have to consent to eating their greens. They don't have to consent to going to school. We make them do things because we think they're good for them. A child does not have to give his or her consent. So consent on that level is very, very shaky as well. So I think if Freud was alive today, looking at our culture, he'd say, man, you're living very dangerously here, because you're hanging an awful lot on this issue of consent, and really it's like a spider's web thread that's trying to support the whole moral edifice of society at this point.
Because it's not really based upon well, okay, that's my observation to me. It's not based upon a moral premise. It's based upon personal desire and people going along with the personal desire. And that's really the essence of the whole ethic,
Yeah,
if you will.
yeah. I mean, the moral. If there is a moral premise, it's the one that I can do whatever I want to do as long as I'm not harming somebody else, physically, financially, or psychologically. It's okay for me to do what I want to do. That's why serial killers are still out of bounds, because they harm people.
I hope so.
but beyond that, the ethic is really, as long as I'm, to use Thomas Jefferson's analogy, as long as I'm not picking somebody's pocket or breaking their leg, it's okay for me to do it.
Well, I wonder how much of this is based just upon personal comfort and what people feel at a time frame, the zeitgeist, if you will, the age. If like I know for years, I don't know, for a while now, I've been saying, back when homosexuality was like really escalating, and I was one of the voices saying that, look, approving that opens the door to so many other things, like, polygamy and incest and pedophilia, and people looked at me like I was an idiot. Like, those are not connected. They're not the same thing. That's apples and oranges. That these are two grown adults just doing their thing, and you're talking about something that's just, no one would think of doing it. At the time, I was like, well, no one thought of this just a few decades before. This was unthinkable, yet here we are. A couple decades, you're going to see those things, and I think I've seen these things gain in popularity just the same, because it's based upon the comfort of society. Like, once we get used to the idea of something, it's almost like, well, if everybody's okay with it, the consent part, then I guess it's, right to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would take it back further than homosexuality. I would say as soon as sex becomes merely recreational, which is really what the 60s established as normative, then you're building your sexual ethic merely on a principle of consent. And at that point, all of these other things become potentially acceptable. Throw into the mix in the last 10, 15 years the rise and significance of internet pornography. And you have a lethal cocktail in some ways, because one of the things that studies on internet pornography have shown is that those who use internet pornography, we might put it this way, the imaginative range is expanded of acceptable behaviors. And so things that, as you say, were even 20 years ago inconceivable now become imaginable, because people are seeing these things on the internet. And there is a definite connection between use of internet pornography and an expansion of what one considers to be acceptable sexual behavior. That's an established fact.
Well, and I would even say, I mean, I've seen this in some places where there are some who argue that even a child can give consent.
Yes, although, as I've said, that's, when you think that childhood consent is not legally required for a lot of things that adults do to children. Even if we were to say, even the argument the child can't give consent isn't a strong one for maintaining a sexual ethic at this point. So, yeah, we're in a very fluid situation at the moment where it's hard to know where it's going to go, but it's hard to be optimistic that it's going to go anywhere good.
Historically speaking, then, you go from Rousseau onward. What was it? Is the general trend based upon the ideas of personal liberties and freedom that have kind of led us to this point?
To an extent, that's certainly part of it. There are other strands to the narrative. There's an interesting shift on the philosophical, political left in the 20th century, where they come to identify oppression not in the classical left-wing sense. My grandfather was a trade unionist. He was a sort of classical man of the left. And for my grandfather, oppression would have been not being given a fair day's wage for an honest day's work, not being able to find employment. Those kind of easily graspable things that most of us can sympathize with as, that's oppression. In the middle of the 20th century, the shift takes place where oppression comes to be identified with limits placed on personal behavior, particularly sexual behavior. So the whole sexual ethic gets highly politicized. It doesn't just become a matter of personal preference at that point, but political liberation becomes identified with sexual liberation. You get this most dramatically expressed in the 1960s, 1968, the student protests. This is a central part of what's going on there. And that's the world that we now live in the wake of. When you think of the big political questions of our day, oddly, considering the grand sweep of history, but totally explicably considering our more recent history, a lot of the big questions revolve around sexual identity and sexual behavior, LGBTQ plus kind of issues. And so it's not simply that the notion of liberty has been expanded to include all these things. Hey, you're free to do them. It's become a kind of political imperative that not just liberty, but liberation involves the shattering of these taboos. And not only that, but the marginalizing or the delegitimizing of any objections there may be to these kinds of behaviors, which gives us the very potent sexual politics that we have at this particular point in time.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
And how much is that tied to one's notion of equality as well? Because to my mind, you have two versions of equality. You have you're equal, and you may have different results, but you're both considered equal. But then there's the equality of everyone must be the same and have the same.
Yeah, I think equality plays into it. I mean, it's 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of Christians were saying, well, we could certainly envisage a situation where homosexuality, for example, is tolerated. We don't want to send people to prison for what consenting adults do in the privacy of their own bedroom. That would be distasteful. I think it's become very clear, of course, that tolerance was not what was wanted. Equality was what was wanted, and equality really means equality is down to what I call in the book recognition. That it's one thing for you to say, I tolerate you, I tolerate your identity. What you're really saying there is, I don't approve of your identity, but I'm not going to sanction you because of it.
Right.
Equality is something different. Equality says, not only am I going to tolerate your identity, I'm going to affirm it. I'm going to affirm it, and therefore affirm you as legitimate. And that's why there's so much passion about things like whether a baker will bake a cake for a gay wedding. On the one side, Christians will say, well, the gay couple, they can get a cake down the road. What's the problem? They're not starving because of this. The baker said he'll bake him a cake for any other thing they do, a birthday party or whatever. He just won't do it for a wedding. From the LGBTQ perspective, what the baker's saying is, I do not recognize your identity. You're not equal to me because you are illegitimate. So, yeah, equality is a part of this as well, definitely.
And recognition, that's a good way to put it as well, the acceptance. Because there's a you say tolerance, and to me, I think I tolerate you. Some people use the word tolerance, and it means you must affirm, embrace, and even endorse. Otherwise, you're not viewing them as an equal, I suppose, with them.
And I would say that's beyond tolerance. I'm thinking of tolerance really in a kind of legal way that, as nonconformists in England were tolerated in the late 17th and 18th century, you can have your Baptist church and we won't send you to prison, but you're not going to be able to hold a teaching position at a university or be a member of parliament. That's tolerance. There's no punishment, no positive punishment attached to it. I think equality is something bigger. Not only that, but that you will have the potential to have every legal and cultural affirmation that somebody else has.
Right. And I guess then the question in my head is there a line to be drawn on that? Is there a point where you can get to and say, but not here? Or does that principle demand that almost anything goes?
I think that principle, I don't think it demands almost anything goes, but I think it demands a revolution in what goes. And that, I would say, for example, that we're going to probably get to a position where a lot of people in America are very quick to use the word persecution surrounding the discomfort of being a Christian in certain areas these days. I don't think we're going to see persecution necessarily in America, but I think we'll find that Christianity ceases to be recognized and becomes merely tolerated.
Irony.
Okay, you can worship in your. We see this even in the shift of language from freedom of expression to freedom of worship. You can, freedom of exercise rather than freedom of worship.
Yes.
You can worship in your building on a Sunday,
Right.
but you can't bring that into the workplace. And there you have a situation where it's not that anything goes; it's that a new set of orthodoxies are now recognized, and a new set of heresies are now tolerated. And Christianity is going to be, I think, one of the new heresies. I suspect conservative Judaism and Islam will also find themselves in that kind of situation in the long run. Yes, you can do what you want in your synagogue or your mosque, but don't expect it to be recognized in the public square.
Right. I'm not a professional historian, but that's only because I don't get paid for it. I love history. And from what I have seen through history is everywhere there's these movements with this demand for a set of equality, it's in the end, it ends up being a lot of times mainly either a role reversal or a flipping of something. But then some of the things that were kind of on principle against ends up just creeping up again in a different form. Is that sort of what we see here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you even see this in some leading gay writers. Andrew Sullivan, for example, has made the point that the campaign for gay rights, he said, was never about stopping, demanding that Christian bakers bake cakes. He says, what we have become is exactly what we criticized. We have become those who are as bullying and tyrannical in our approach to people who are different to us as we experienced ourselves 20, 30 years ago. So I do think there's a new kind of conformist tyranny kicking in. It's not the old Puritanism, if you like, of the New England colonies. It's the new Puritanism of the socially progressive dimensions of our political classes.
Because I was once in a conversation where someone about that case of the baking of the cake, and this one person was adamant that they should have just baked it, and to separate business from the religious scruples and all this other thing. And there was this debate going on, me and a couple other individuals, and someone threw out a very good illustration to me, which has always stuck with me. If you go to a Jewish baker, and who had family who survived the Holocaust, and this guy says, "I want you to put a swastika on my cake for whatever, we're having a rally or something," right? And if that Jew was to say, "Well, I don't want to bake that cake," would you fault the man, or would you allow him to keep his conscience? And I was like, that's a very good illustration.
That's a good point. I mean, the one I use in class when I teach this with the kids at Grow as well is I use the example of a Baptist minister. I'm a Presbyterian. I believe that infants should be baptized. Do I have the right to go to the local Baptist minister and demand that he baptizes my child? And I said, well, no, he should have a religious conscience exemption on that. Of course he should. But, okay, so where do you draw the line? And then I think we get down to the line is somewhat arbitrarily drawn by what society considers to be cool and tasteful, and what society has no real interest in or finds to be despicable and distasteful. Society doesn't care about the Christian cake baker anymore, but society does care about the LGBTQ people, and so you're up against a kind of loaded deck at that particular point.
So these societal pressures, that's always fascinating me, because on one hand you have society forming people, but then within that society you have people who are not going to let society form them, and maybe end up altering society down the road anyway. Yeah. How much of a give and take is tied here? Because how much of it is society makes this happen versus just determined individuals making this happen?
It's hard to tell. I mean, that in some ways that's the great puzzle of history, the relationship of mass movements to individuals. I would say this: if you look at the success of the LGBTQ movement over the last 20, 30 years, it's very clear that their success has been derived from the fact they're powerful communities. These are people who love each other, care for each other, look after each other. They operate as a block. They're highly organized. So I would say, as Christians looking on to this, the stuff we can learn from that society is, in some ways, is not changed by getting one piece of legislation passed. The Defense of Marriage Act, how well did that work in the end? Not very, it lasted for a little bit, but then it was overturned. I think so. The way to change society is to start locally, to start with your local church, to start with being a loving, tight-knit Christian community, open and welcoming to the outsider, the stranger, the sojourner, and to see how that can ultimately galvanize a culture. I'm not a big, we can solve our problems. I mean, I'm delighted this morning to hear that Amy Coney Barrett was appointed to the Supreme Court. That's great. But I'm also hopefully astute enough to know that the Supreme Court, it's significant, but it's ultimately not as significant as the broader way that the culture imagines itself and sees itself and understands itself. It's a small step, but it doesn't solve our problem by any stretch of the imagination. We've got to think about being consistent Christian communities in our local communities.
So how much of the role of the church and the things within its teachings on theology and practices, how much did you cover on that within your book, and what was the church complicit in? Where did it go wrong? Where did it go right? What would you find?
Well, I think the church is definitely complicit. I mean, we're all individually complicit in what's going on, and the church is complicit. In some ways, the way of thinking about the self as the expressive individual, this sort of psychological self that I talked about, that's the air we breathe. It's hard to break free from that. And how is the church complicit in contemporary culture? Well, many ways. We choose our churches now. Church is kind of a consumer choice.
Right.
Even within 15-mile radius of my house here, there are probably a dozen churches that I would be very comfortable choosing to worship at. That's very different to the Middle Ages, where, hey, as I said, you grow up in a village, there's one church, you're baptized, married, and buried in the same church. You're very closely tied.
Right.
It's not a choice; it's a given. Secondly, I think for all of the hoo-ha and rhetoric about the redefinition of marriage in 2015 by the Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges, the church's toleration of no-fault divorce is really a toleration of exactly the same logic as Obergefell versus Hodges. Obergefell rests on the idea that marriage is a relationship between two people contracted for their convenience, for their comfort, for their happiness, and as soon as it ceases to provide those, it's okay to go your separate ways. How many churches have taken action against congregants who've got married, got divorced because it wasn't working for them anymore? That's complicity in the culture. So I certainly think, as far as my book's concerned, there's not much room for praying the Pharisees' prayer. I thank you, Lord, that we're not like other men, like these LGBT people over here. No, in some ways we're very like them. We're part of the same culture. The solution is, there's no single silver bullet solution. I do deal in the last chapter with how the church might respond. And again, there are a couple of things. One, I think, first of all, the church needs to realize that she's oriented to heaven, not to this earth. We are exiles in this earth. We want this earth to be as good as it can be. But our home is ultimately not here, but in the new heavens and the new earth. So the church needs to orient its people not towards despairing about what's going on here and now, but to the hope of what is to come, the glory that is to come. And secondly, as I alluded to a few moments ago, I think community. If we want to make an impact on society, if we want to see LGBTQ people converted to Christ, it's not enough to tell them the gospel. We also have to show them that we're a community. Rosaria Butterfield's work on hospitality is rooted in her own background in the LGBTQ movement. And in her conversion narrative, she says she was shocked at how, when she was converted to Christ, she assumed she was leaving one strong community for another strong community. It's not a shock that the church was not as loving a community as the one she was leaving. So I think we also need to think very much not what we believe, how we believe it, but also how we live as a Christian community.
Yes, my theological beacons are on fire right now with with everything you've brought up. There's so much there. That'd be a whole nother show, I think, to discuss that. A lot of this, I guess, goes back to this idea of consent, of even picking and choosing what's right or wrong, even within the church. I'm against homosexuality, but hey, I'm getting divorced next week, and everybody's like cheering you on for it. In the body of Christ.
Yeah. Or even at a more trivial level, my minister, he wears ties that I don't like, or just, the guy down the road preaches better, so I'm just going to forget my membership vows and walk off and go down the road. That's expressive individualism. It may not be as egregious as some other examples we could think of, but that idea that I am sovereign and that the church exists to make me feel good. Philip Reeve has this in one of his works. Philip Reeve has this, what I consider to be a really kind of shocking but profound statement. He says, in the Middle Ages, people did not go to church. We said in earlier times, people did not go to church to be made happy. They went to have their misery explained to them, which is a kind of grim. But on one hand, I think, how many of us go to church now because of how it makes us feel? It gives us that buzz, rather than to actually have the world and its tragedy explained to us in terms of creation, fall, redemption.
That's a very interesting way of putting that. I suppose, and it's a question with the church itself on its standards, its concepts of community versus the individual, and like you said, the loving one another.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus said, "You will know my disciples how how you love one another."
Community,
and that's supposed to be a very key point of recognizing his church versus not his church.
Yeah, I mean, it's 15 years ago now when the emergent church sort of exploded onto the scene, and I was one of those who was very critical of some of the doctrinal stands the emergent church took. But one of the things that the early emergent church got right was the importance of community, and the importance of loving each other and being in community. And that's something I think that as the religious culture of America declines and as the church becomes more marginal, religious community is going to become far more important to our survival than it has been in the past.
I think it's very important, the concept of community. That if you read the book of Acts, that's what they were in a very trying time. And I guess, historically speaking, I'm assuming you're not originally from the United States.
I'm from Camden, New Jersey, actually. You can probably tell by my accent.
Yeah, sure.
I'm from very far east.
Yeah, so I know within the American mindset, and I realize this even though I did not grow up in the church, I wasn't instructed about all these things. Later in life, I learned them, studied them, still do. But in our experience, the American experience, the church has always been, for the most part of our nation's history, a prominent force. And it commanded a lot of respect. It had a big voice. When we did things, a lot of times it was with a bang. It was, these big evangelical events, these big shows, these big speakers. You had press coverage of these things all the time, magazine write-ups, these great events going on. And now here we are at a time where it's like, no one cares for the scripture. No one cares for God. No one wants to come to your event. That's great. You feed the poor. The government does it better. These sort of things. It's almost like a psychological blow, don't you think?
It is. And I think the temptation to despair is very strong at points. But I think maybe we should be thinking about this as an opportunity. I don't know if your listeners will appreciate a poker analogy, but bottom line is you got to play with the hand that you're dealt. If you've got rubbish hand, there's no point wishing you got 4 aces and a wild card or something. You've got to play the hand you're dealt. So I would say, this is not a time to to despair. It's certainly a time to lament. It's certainly a time to lament.
Yes.
It's a time to repent. But it's not a time to despair. There are opportunities that now present themselves. In some ways, it's going to be easier to be a distinctive Christian in the world that's coming. When everybody claims to be a Christian, it's hard to be distinctive. It's going to be much easier to be a distinctive Christian. Again, one of the things that helped make the LGBTQ movement a strong community was precisely their marginality, the fact that they weren't mainstream. Maybe it's going to be easier to be a strong community when all of our backs are against the wall, if you like, when we're feeling the pressure. So much as I think, it's a time to lament, and it's, would that I lived at a time when much happier and greater things were happening. I don't. I got to make the most of it. I think we need to try to look for the opportunities at this point that we have, make the most of what we've got.
Absolutely. I'm with Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, coming out November 25th. You can pre-order that on Amazon.com. You primarily focus on the sexual revolution. Is that your primary focus?
That's the culmination, the last couple of chapters,
okay.
Yeah.
Carl, I appreciate you being with us today. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and thanks again for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
For this essay segment, I want to talk about, truth. Knowing truth. How do we determine if something is true or not true? And should I accept a contrary truth if it conflicts with, my truth? As we are talking through this interview, you've probably heard where we are talking about people confirming the truth because it's something that comes from inside of them. They verify who they are as an individual because of something that comes from the inside, not necessarily what forms them from the outside. That it's a personal feeling, perhaps even a determination that I'm going to be this, or this is me, and because I'm the one setting that parameter, everyone else has to accept it also as being true. This is based upon the perspective of that it comes from within yourself, that we have the power to somehow craft us contrary to any other thing that exists, and because we are the ones who craft it, then it must be true. Now, of course, this type of approach and mentality, in line with what we were discussing with his recent book, it applies mainly to sexuality, the type of sexuality that one may engage in, that, whether a person feels like they're a woman trapped in a man's body, for example, as he was given as an example. And how do you verify such a thing? I mean, first of all, empirically looking at it, you see a man, he's a man, but he thinks he's a woman trapped in there. Is there like some inner being crying out, help, I'm a woman and I'm trapped in this body? But because there's the feeling maybe, or the fantasy, the imagination, maybe others have impressed it upon them, or some kind of reaction, physical reaction within them, and they assumed, I must be a woman trapped in a man's body. That's, but because of that feeling, and because that feeling is endorsed by others, that's kind of embraced as, that must be who I am then. I'm really a woman, but somehow I got stuck in the wrong body. And that's one thing to think that way. But it's another when you demand that everyone else confirms what you think is true within yourself as well. And that's probably where a lot of this conflict comes from then. When I look at a man, I see a man. When he demands, no, I'm a woman and you will treat me like one, I'm thinking, but you're a man. That's what I have to look at and see and observe. But I'm being informed by the person, no, you've been tricked and deceived. I'm actually a woman and I got stuck in the wrong body. And okay, maybe by the way I feel inside, that's not correct. But see, that's where the conflict is with this type of mentality. There's this great desire to demand that others verify what you personally feel inside. but I don't feel what you feel. Others don't feel what you feel. If we all go with this approach that, well, I feel it, and because I feel it, you have to condone it and you have to vindicate it, and you're not allowed to counter what I feel on the inside, even if it appears to go contrary to the face of reality, am I really to be expected to do that? Can you really expect others to verify what you feel you should be viewed as an individual on the inside when everyone else don't see it? I mean, let's apply this exercise to a few other things. I mean, for example, let's say I believe I'm Napoleon. I feel like I'm Napoleon and I'm reincarnated and I'm stuck in Philip's body and I'm just waiting to come out again. And you should address me as, emperor, and treat me like an emperor. Why? Because that's how I feel on the inside. I'm an emperor trapped in Philip's body. Now, you're probably listening to that and saying, yeah, whatever, that's ridiculous, right? But what if I really felt that way? Well, no one feels that way. Well, maybe there's someone is. I mean, there's been other people that have wanted to be identified as some lizard, and they distort their face with tattoos and whatever to be considered some kind of dragon, right? Do I go along with that fantasy? Like, you're not a dragon, you're a person. I mean, would you tell me, hey, Napoleon, great to see you, Emperor, Your Highness, how are you doing? Fully knowing I'm not that guy. How far do we entertain people's fantasies before we say, I'm not vindicating this no more? You're obviously not who you think you feel inside, and I don't have to play along with that. Why? Because I can tell it's not true. Just as much as you can look at me and say, yep, you're not Napoleon. That can be applied in so many levels in regards to this. The demand that something be verified that's unseen in somebody else, I think, is a very high demand. And it goes contrary to just basic common sense and reasoning. Instead, truth should be known by what we find to be true, what is objective. See, the problem with that version of truth, it's modernistic, of course, well, postmodern. It's subjective. It's as each person wants to make it true, they make it true. We honestly believe falsely that we can make things true by sheer willpower. And that's where the fallacy comes in. Truth just exists. Truth is a priori, and it's revealed to us, and we discover what's true. If we can't discover what's true, then our scientific basis is absolutely zero. If we can create reality with no basis in reality, then there's really no basis for science whatsoever. There's no empirical observation and testing and objectivity. That's erased. And often we can find out better about ourselves, who we are, when we are tested against each other. We find out truly who we are as individuals by our interaction with other individuals. We realize our differences. Maybe when I'm dealing with someone that's, has a better military knowledge than I do, and they say crush me in some kind of military simulation, maybe my view of being Napoleon gets kind of undone. Maybe I'm like, ooh, that's like my Waterloo, and you're Wellington. The guy's like, no, I'm not Wellington, and you're not Napoleon, and I just beat you, and that proves you don't know what you're doing. I mean, maybe that'll be a wake-up call, right? That how we are in testing in one another helps better define our reality. I can think I'm going to be I'm this great heavyweight boxer of the world, and everyone has to call me champ. But the minute I get into the ring with a champ and pummels me and makes me look silly, that's when reality sets in. Maybe I'm not a boxing champ, right? By all means, I might train for it. I might condition myself and study that martial art more so that I'm better at it. But then that's something that would be earned. But for someone to demand that you look at me like a boxing champ because I feel it on the inside, I'm like, well, you better prove it first. And that's sort of the point of it all. This whole idea that I can dream it up in the middle of me and everyone else has to confirm it is ridiculous. You want to make something true? Show it's true. Sometimes we will clash into things and find out, well, that really wasn't true. And you know what? that betters our understanding of things and we move on. It's okay to be wrong. And with that idea, I just want to throw this little scenario out there for you as I close. Let's say you thought about something about yourself and on the inside you really felt it. And there's people like this, all right? Maybe you thought that I was a woman and I'm trapped in a man's body, but then you turn away from that and you become a man again somehow. And you know what? There's people like this. You know, it was more of an experimental thing that they did than an actual discovery of themselves, and they kind of flipped back to what they came from. So can their truth change? Does truth change because of their feeling? They thought they were a homosexual, but now they feel they're not. Well, which feeling's true? You see what I'm saying? How do we verify that? Can your truth keep changing every other month because of what you feel? There's a reason that the Bible tells us that our heart is deceptive and not to trust it, and that we don't let our feelings rule our passions and rule what we view as truth. That's why we have logos in addition to the pathos in our reasoning capabilities. We have to accept truth as it is. We have to accept the truth for what it is, even if we don't like what's true. Why? Because it's the truth. And trust me, there are times where we will come across things that we don't like it for being true. But that doesn't make it any more untrue simply because our feelings are in dispute with it. We should remember the wisdom of the ancients to discover what is true and to conform to that truth rather than fighting that truth and replacing it with falsehood.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.